Today's homework has to do with thermodynamics, and this is the principle that governs all of the energy relationships. It's very important to our understanding of the biological environment. To begin with, we need to know the first two laws. This may or may not be review for some of you. The first law of thermodynamics talks about energy being conserved. Energy can neither be created nor destroyed, but it can be transformed. That's why we have to be very, very careful with the verbs that we use when referring to energy. It can be exchanged from one organism to another, and we're going to see that when we talk about food chains. The second law is sometimes referred to as the law of entropy. To put it simply, in any energy transformation, you're going to lose some of the energy in its usable form. The energy isn't gone, it's just no longer available to be used. Most of the times, this loss is in the form of heat. That's going to be very, very important to those of us that are endotherms. That means that we can maintain our body temperature, and we do that by capturing and holding on to some of that heat that's lost in some of these reactions. This is very, very important. Any discussion of energy in an environmental science class must investigate the following two questions. Where does the energy needed for living organisms originate? And how is the energy used by these organisms? So we probably already know that the energy originates, most of it originates from the sun, the electromagnetic radiation from the sun. It's been estimated that 58% of the radiation directed toward the Earth is reflected or absorbed as heat by our atmosphere, so it's lost to us in usable form. Less than 2% of this remaining radiation is used by the plants, and then that balance is transformed on the Earth's surface into heat, the balance of that. Other sources of energy that should be noted that are not considered from the sun are geothermal volcanic activity. They're occurring naturally, and that energy is radiating or emanating from inside of the Earth. But the bulk of our energy input comes from the sun. So living things have to conform to the laws of thermodynamics, those two laws, which you have to know. Consider living organisms as temporary storage units for useful energy, whereby one organism can be used by another as a source of energy. That's the whole idea of eating breakfast, lunch, and dinner and all those snacks. In its transfer from one organism to another, useful energy is lost to the environment in the form of heat until the useful energy is ultimately consumed. So remember, energy cannot be recycled. There's a continuous requirement for new energy to enter the system. That energy is, for the most part, from the sun. Okay, let's do this quick review. We've talked already about photosynthesis. So, carbon dioxide from the air. Water is predominantly absorbed from the soil up into the roots of the plants. This occurs in plants for the most part, some photosynthetic algae as well. There's this series of chemical reactions. We're not going to get into the detail of those reactions, but we know that it involves light and it involves chlorophyll, which is needed to trap the energy temporarily. And that energy gets transferred into the bonds of glucose. Now there are other molecules as well, but glucose is the one that we generally use. You'll see in this diagram, for example, they talk about starch being storage, and glucose is a monosaccharide. It's the most basic of the starches. We also get oxygen, and that oxygen, by the way, comes from water, not from the carbon dioxide. It comes from here. And that turns out to be a very, very, very helpful molecule, but not as far as energy transport. So the plants are using this for their own purposes. They have to repair, they have to grow, they have to move things around inside of themselves, so they're going to use that energy. But we're very, very lucky that plants tend to store more energy than they need for their own purposes. And thus, we get to utilize that extra energy. So all of us, all living things, are undergoing some form of cellular respiration. It occurs in the mitochondria, that's the little organelle inside the cells, releases the energy from the bonds of glucose. So it breaks these bonds apart. Those aren't fours, those are supposed to be arrows. Breaks those bonds apart, releases that energy, and stores them temporarily in a molecule called ATP. You should be familiar with ATP, though it may have been a while since you've heard of it, but it does store energy in a useful form for the cells to use. So glucose is a long-term energy storage, ATP is short-term energy storage. All right, this leads us to trophic levels, food chains, and energy pyramids. And again, some of this is going to be review for some of you, but not for others. A producer or autotroph is an organism that makes its own food either by converting light, so you may hear them referred to as photoautotrophs, also known as plants or photosynthetic algae. There are some photosynthetic protists as well, or utilizing other molecules. This is called chemosynthesis, and examples of these would be extremophiles, mainly microscopic organisms that live in places like hot springs or down in the deep recesses under high pressure in the oceans. They're pretty rare, so most of what we're going to be talking about are the photoautotrophs. And you need to know that a producer and autotroph, the two terms mean the same thing. A consumer or heterotroph receives its energy by consuming or absorbing it from other organisms. You have to know those two terms are pretty interchangeable. Each step in the transfer of energy, autotroph to heterotroph or heterotroph to heterotroph, is known as a trophic level, and it must follow the laws of thermodynamics. These trophic levels can be represented in several ways. As I said, food chains, food webs, or pyramids, and the pyramids can be a pyramid of energy, pyramid of biomass, or pyramid of number, and we're going to look at each of these. So here are two food chains. One's terrestrial, meaning land, and others marine. And we see at the bottom we have our producers, and sometimes you'll see it referred to as primary producers. There really are no secondary producers. So plants on land and phytoplankton in the water. You have herbivores, which are plant eaters. So they are also known as primary consumers. So herbivore eats only plants. Carnivores eat other animals. So carnivores are meat eaters. And by meat I could mean in insects, it's just not plants. And so you see you go from primary consumer to secondary consumer to tertiary consumer, and that all references how many things are in the chain. Notice the direction of the arrow. It's very, very important. Arrows show flow of energy. Energy flow. So the direction of the arrow shows what is doing the eating. The grasshopper is eating the flower, the mouse is eating the grasshopper, the snake eats the mouse, the hawk eats the snake. So the flow of energy is upwards. So that straight line is a food chain, but most habitats are much more complex than that. So you have food webs. Here's an example of a food web. Again, you're showing the arrows indicating the flow of energy, and it is possible that an organism might eat, for example, you have this mouse, and you notice that he's eating the leaf, he's also eating the grasshopper. That means he's an omnivore. Omnivores eat plants and meat. And thus the title of your summer reading, Omnivore's Dilemma. And food webs can get pretty complex. This one is a fairly simple one, and you have to learn to be able to draw them, be able to interpret them, and so we will be practicing those. Now, this information could also be portrayed in various pyramids. And here's a pyramid showing the producers at this level. In this case, it's aquatic, so you have algae and phytoplankton. The primary consumers, so you have producers, primary consumers, and so what would this be? This would be secondary consumers. Don't worry about these orders, these first order, second order. That just starts to get really confusing. But one of the things that the pyramids represent is the loss of available energy. And this has to do with what we call the 10% rule. Well, here's another pyramid. This is the pyramid of numbers. Look at the number of plants, number of grasshoppers, many fewer the birds, and your upper level carnivores, fewer even still. So here's the 10% rule. In the majority of ecosystems, each level that you move up will provide only 10% of the energy that was available in the prior level. The rest of it is either lost through the metabolic activities of the prior level organisms or lost as heat, like you see here. And thus, you get the pyramid shape. You get your pyramid numbers. There are many fewer of this top order because there's only 10% of the energy from here to here. There's only 10% of that 10% from here to here. And then only 10% of that when you get up here. So there's so much less energy available the higher up that you go in the food chain. So the ecological pyramids, you can have the energy pyramid showing that 10% available. You can have the pyramid based on numbers of organisms, and then something called pyramid of biomass, and that has to do with just exactly what it says, how much living mass there is in the organisms as you move up the pyramid. And here's a nice comparison of the three. Notice you get the same shape for all three. The divisions might be slightly different, but you'll have the same organisms. You're going to have your producers on the bottom, and your primary consumers are going to be on the next level, and then your secondary consumers and third level or tertiary consumers. It's just what you're using to measure is going to differ in each one. So we're going to be working with this information in our next class, and if you find it necessary to go back and review all of this, you can do that.